Welcome to another edition of Minot Matters, where we continue to sit down with city council candidates, and today an incumbent, as we are coming upon the June 11th election day that you should be aware of. Today we're sitting down with current city council member Scott Burlingame. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for this opportunity to allow us to tell our stories and talk about the city of Minot and what's going on. So I really appreciate this opportunity.
Absolutely. First off, let's just talk about you for a minute. I don't think we have, I know you were on our podcast before with the Human Relations Committee, but I don't think we spent much time on it at that time because we were more focused on that. How long you been in Minot? What brought you to Minot? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
You know, I moved here about 15 years ago. I came here because, much like many people that come here, it was for a job. And also, like a lot of people that move here, when I first got here, thought I'd be here for a while, and then I'm going to leave again. And there was something that happened that I never expected to happen. My wife and I had both, kind of had lives where we moved around quite a bit. And then all of a sudden we found a place that we liked, and we found a place that became home. Yeah. I was talking to a friend of mine a while back, and she said to me, Scott, we need to get to the point where if you live here, if this is where you're home, this is where you're from. And so Minot became the home that I'm from. And that's kind of my story of how I got into Minot.
So the job got you here, but what were maybe one or two qualities that kept you?
I think Minot is it has so much amazing potential.
Yeah.
There's so much wonderfulness. And I know that, look, I'm a politician now, and I'm an alderman. But well before that, I really believed that there's just so much potential here. There's so much opportunities for growth. And I think that's really what it was. The cliche answer is to say the people.
Yeah.
But I really do believe that it's that combination of things. I think that we have the good North Dakota values that I appreciate and I love. And then we also have, like, with the air base and with all the folks coming in and out from there, with the oil boom and the good and the bad that came with that, and the potential and the opportunities. I really fell in love with that in this community. And that's really... That's why this became my town.
Right.
So
absolutely. Does it ever feel weird to say that you're a politician?
It feels weird every single time I say it. I usually say it very much in jest, because I'm not naturally a politician.
Right.
We can talk about that a little bit, but I'm not a person that sits up all night watching cable news live and,
right.
and trying to compare and contrast the different candidates and all that kind of stuff. That's not who I am. There was maybe a time in my life when I did that, but I quickly realized how unproductive that is, and I'd much rather get busy volunteering or helping out a neighbor than doing that kind of stuff.
What brought you into the political game?
I've always believed in service. My dad was, and I talked about this during the Chamber of Commerce's thing, my dad was a U.S. Marine, served our country for 27 years. My mom was a Sunday school superintendent. My dad, after he left the service, was a volunteer firefighter. So I just grew up in a family that very much believed in service, and my service was going to be different. And I started off by serving. In my first jobs were in the nonprofit world, serving people with disabilities, trying to make the community better that way, and then through that expanding out to doing everything I could to serve community. It just kind of felt like when I was ready to run that I could maybe help out a little bit more. I could use my God-given skills, such as they are, to help out this community and to help out people. And so that's why I decided to run. Absolutely.
And of course, now you're running for re-election. You're going to be a lifelong? Is this, you have goals of being here for 15, 18? I know that's so far into the future that you really can't comment on it, but what's your thought on your time frame of how long you would want to be in city council?
I am definitely not going to be a lifer. I listen to people that have done this this is my 7th, 8th term, and I have zero desire to ever do that.
Yeah. I
mentioned to you, I'm here for service.
Right.
I believe the best thing we can do with service is to eventually crack the door open to allow somebody else to come in and do that job.
Absolutely.
I have no interest in doing this. And honestly, I don't really love the campaigning. I have somebody else that's like, I love that. It's my thing. I love connecting with people. I love talking to people. But the last thing I want to talk about is myself. I want to listen. And I don't want to be in there being like, here's my 5 points that I'm going to do for Minot. And I recognize that that's what people want out of somebody running for office. But I'd much rather listen to be like, what are you hearing? What are you seeing? Yeah. What are your hopes and aspirations for the community? I'd much rather do that. So there's a good chance this might be my last term. I don't want to say that 100%, but I definitely don't have any desires. I don't want to. I have a friend of mine who's always teasing me about how I'm going to be mayor someday, and I am like, there is zero chance that's going to happen. I want to serve the people of Minot, and when I'm done with this, I'll move on to somebody else and on to something else, and hopefully crack the door open for somebody else.
Continuing in that vein of service. So as you have been campaigning, I'm sure you've knocked a few doors, handed out a few yard signs and all that. What has been some of the response that you've heard from the citizens of Minot of what their concerns are?
It's interesting because nobody is going to be too surprised by the things we hear.
Yeah.
We obviously hear about property taxes, and I know that's going to be a major topic of our conversation today.
Yeah.
I hear about streets. I hear about, public safety issues. I hear about, I hear about how the city really would like a Chick-fil-A, Super Walmart, or Sam's Club, or a Costco, or what's the fish restaurant?
Like Red Lobster.
Red Lobster. I hear a lot of that. Like, when are we going to get these things? And, I have conversations about, well, I kind of want those things too, but also the city doesn't have much of a role on that. But I hear a lot of those things. But I don't want it to be all negative either. I mean, I also hear a lot about, the good schools that we have here, the opportunities that we have here, how we're just so close to being, we just need a little bit of help. And if we can just get to that next step, that we can open up so much more opportunity.
Yeah. So it is an interesting conversation, and we don't need to delve too far into it, that of Chick-fil-A and Sam's Club and Red Lobster. Obviously, we're not going to talk about specifically those things, but population plays a role in those things. And do you know, from sitting on the council and maybe having conversations with the Chamber EDC or maybe others, do you know what kind of population we need to be at before none of those places specifically, but in general, we start getting into another game?
Getting to that micro metropolitan area, that 50,000 population that we were certified at, helps a lot.
Gotcha.
I think that does really begin to open up the doors. That's not the only thing, but in order to get to that point, it begins to open up the doors. So I think that was a good first step. Now, there are other first steps. I mean, we have to deal with workforce issues. We have to deal with other economic indicators that we can show to things. And that's one of those things that when I talk to people about what is the role of the city and what isn't, look, the city's not going to, bring Chick-fil-A to this community.
No, it's not.
But the city can help show that we have the economic indicators that they want,
right?
And that we have the climate that they want, and we can work with the Chamber EDC in order to help promote us as a business friendly community and to make improvements to that. So that is the thing that the city can do, is to say, hey, we are open for business, and here's what we're doing. Right,
which I think segues really well into a question that I wanted to ask, which is, what is the role that the city government should be playing in the city?
That is a big question.
Yeah.
I think that it's always interesting to me, because when you hear like real political pundits, they'll say things like the government isn't the solution to the problem, the government is the problem. And I tend to agree with that. However, that being said, that doesn't mean that the government doesn't play a role.
Right.
Because I think, as I said, the working on to improve the climate in order to allow businesses to come here can be the role of that. And part of that is in, the good old fashioned things like roads and sewer and water and things like that. If I come to a community and I'm looking to invest several $1 million in that community, or if I'm a local investor that wants to invest millions of dollars in this community and I see the roads aren't being taken care of, or the sewers and the water is not good and stuff like that, I'm probably not likely to do that. So that real hardcore industry, public safety, fire and water and things like, or fire and police and things like that. Those kind of things matter for the purposes of making our community open, welcome, and investing for those people.
Right. And then something else that you mentioned, and this isn't necessarily in the role of government, but is definitely something we want to talk about: workforce growth and retention. This seems to be a problem in the area of, for whatever reason, there's a lot of places that have entry level, maybe a little bit higher than that, positions that are always open. Maybe some of the higher positions are filled, maybe they're not. It depends on the place, but for sure, there's a lot of job openings around town. You don't have to look hard to find them. What is there a role that the city should be playing into helping with that need?
Yeah, it's all sort of related to the same answer that I gave earlier, which is, first off, employees can work anywhere they want to. We boomed here during the oil boom time because the economy was terrible the rest of the country, and here there was jobs. So we attracted people from all over the country and sometimes all over the world to Minot. That is no longer the case. Now there's jobs everywhere. So people have, more than any time probably in history, people have a real opportunity to choose where they want to live. And so the city government, I think, can play a role in what we can do to make Minot the most welcoming community as possible in order to be the place that people choose to come down on. And again, the park district plays a huge role in that.
Yeah.
The school district plays a huge role in that. The city plays a huge role in that, in the things that I talked about: public safety, streets, water, sewer, economic climate, working on improving sort of the bureaucracy that goes in. So if I want to come here, how can I ensure that the doors are open and things like that? I think those are the roles that the city plays, and we can't pretend that that's not important. I'd love to be able to say, hey, if we just get out of the way, that everybody's going to want to choose Minot. But when other communities, we are competing against other communities on a local, regional, and national level, and when those communities are doing things that we're not, people are going to choose to go to those communities. So we have got to remain competitive in that global and regional marketplace for employees. And I've talked about this quite a bit, that we have to look at economic development differently than what we used to. It used to be economic development was about how can I drop a business into your community that will attract employees. And now we got to say we have businesses here now. How can we attract employees?
Right.
And that's a whole different ball of games. And that are... ball of games isn't a word.
It's a whole different ball game for sure, though.
Thank you.
Yeah, it is. And it seems like within that, there's like a lot of like myriad of problems. And problems is always a negative thing. We always look at the problems. There's also the successes, that there's actually surplus of jobs. Not every place always has that, which is a positive thing. But one of the things is daycare availability. And this is something that you've worked hard in the last little bit of researching, looking into, been part of committees on this. How can this be resolved? I mean, I have a friend, his daycare provider just fell through. I saw something on a group where somebody 20 minutes before work said that their daycare provider said they couldn't do it, and it wasn't just that day, it was they were done. They just were no longer able. What is a solution to this problem? And maybe the solution is just private sector. Maybe it's something that the city doesn't get involved in.
Again, as I've said multiple times when I've talked about this recently, the city can't play the entire role. We're not going to save childcare. We're not going to care for your children while you're at work during the day. But that being said, that doesn't mean the city can't do anything. And a lot of the conversations that I've had over the last year and a half since I was elected, and is with providers, with parents, with employers, and all around. I've heard stories just like you just said on people that are, and these are jobs all over the spectrum. These are doctors that can't move here because of childcare, and these are entry level employees who just want to go to work. Yeah, and across the board, I just believe that it is something. So we've talked about a few solutions. There are some current on the books property tax options that the city of Minot doesn't use, but we could, that will allow for, if an employer has childcare on site, that they can get a property tax cut for doing that. And again, well, why does that matter? Well, it matters because if an employer can do it, that'll help incentivize the employees to come there, but it'll also help the city give it a little bit to that. I think that we have some experts on the city level, on city staff that can help daycare entrepreneurs. Just like we help out if somebody was going to come here and open up some business, that they can help them through that process. And we really heard that a lot from people that are in the childcare industry, that the paperwork of starting up a childcare is extraordinarily difficult. So if we can help them with that, there are still some things. We've done a few things already, but there's some things that we can do within our codes and ordinances to make it easier for childcares to open up. And then there's a hodgepodge of other things that we can do too. So there are real things. I guess probably the biggest and the most exciting of that is that we have economic development dollars that we're sitting on and not using. Wow. Those aren't doing us any good sitting in our checking account. Right. Well, if we can help incentivize some childcares to get open and help reduce that cost of entry level into it, they can help pay us back. That can be some magnificent return on investment by getting people working in this community. So
this is something that was brought up, and I don't know, you can say no comment if you want, whatever it is. Okay. But someone specifically said in Minot Eat is difficult to get retained doctors. And you mentioned that in your statement about, or in your answer about childcare, and it doesn't matter what job somebody has, that it's a difficult problem right now. Is there something that needs to change in Minot in order to be able to retain doctors better? And I understand that that's something that maybe the city doesn't really play in. Healthcare is one of those unique things where your city's involved in fire and police, and maybe even in the ambulance a little bit, but not in healthcare itself, as that becomes private. Is there something that the city can do in that area?
I guess I haven't really given my thought to individually just doctors. I will tell you that part of the reason I care about, or I was made aware of childcare, is that I was talking to a recruiter for Trinity who was telling me about not being able to recruit healthcare professionals, and these are good paying jobs to this community because of childcare. That's incredible. That was one of the reasons that I began this whole process, was looking at that and hearing that. And I will say that, Trinity's definitely been willing to be a partner and at the conversation with this, but I think this is a good example where it's got to be a public-private sector solution.
Absolutely.
Like maybe there's some things a public sector can do, but some of those suggestions are going to come from the private sector.
Right.
I don't want to be on city council and at the dais being like, you guys in the private sector need to do this. I want to be like, you guys come to me with solutions, and let's see if there's something that we can do to do that. And if I can point out an example of this that's happened recently, is at Minot State. Obviously a government entity, a government, they have identified a need for childcare. Well, the Minot State Foundation leased out some of the land that they owned for $1 for the next 20 years, so that a private business can come in there and open up a rather large childcare on that site.
Wow.
And be able to save money so that they don't have that land cost. Because the cost of operating a business is oftentimes, what we've learned, is one of the biggest barriers to getting into that. So there's a solution where, obviously a major employer here in town, a major part of this community, has got that ability to work with that private sector solution in order to reduce the cost. So, and those are the kind of things where that came as a result of a local entrepreneur who needed a help through local government.
Very interesting. Well, let's talk about the most exciting topic there is. Property taxes.
Yes, I can't wait.
Yeah, I'm sure. So, let's start here. This pulls a little bit from the forum, and so some people might be excited about this. Some people might not be. You mentioned about the decrease in mills in the last couple of years, and it has decreased in 2023 and 2024. The last increase was in 2022. With the decrease in mills, there's been around a 5% increase in property taxes both years. So basically, the question is this: as these, first off, and this isn't really something you need to respond to, but these mills things, it's so complicated.
It's so ridiculous, isn't it?
Yeah. And maybe that's what needs reformed in this whole conversation. But we've seen these decrease in mills, but we're still seeing the increase, and that's because of assessed values and whatever else that might play into that. Should there be a more standardized thing where we're able to hold a line on that those property taxes in a different way, other than just not increasing mills?
So first off, Jonathan, I want to make sure that I say right on the bat, off the bat here, that I have asked the city manager to put forward a proposal without increasing the cost, the overall valuation of our value of amount that's coming in from property taxes. And
a 0% increase in property taxes.
And I'm not saying we can decrease further than that. And as I talked about during the public comments on this at City Council, is that with the newly introduced primary residence tax credit, that a majority of people should see a decrease, even if we hold it at zero, just because of, as long as they filed that form, which I hope they did.
Yeah.
So I do really believe that we're heading towards an overall tax decrease for a majority of residents in Minot. But that being said, is this the right system? Is it the wrong system? Look, nobody likes paying taxes. I certainly don't.
I'm with you.
Can we reform it? Yes, absolutely. Can we continue to rely on the state legislature to do things like the primary residence tax credit and things like that? Like, they've got a lot more money than what we do, and they've got a lot more flexibility within their budget than we do. But we should we have to stop increasing. And the problem with this, and I want to make sure I talked a little bit about some of the maybe misinformation that's out there.
Yeah.
It's not like the city assessor's office is sitting around diving into Scrooge McDuck's pile of cash because they just want to, increase everybody's property taxes.
Right.
They're required by state law to assess it based on that state law.
Yeah.
And one of the perhaps good things of Minot that's really great if you're selling your house or if you're getting a loan against your house is that the cost of property has continued to go up. That is why we have our housing crisis, is because the cost of property in this town is so good. Now, that can be a good indicator unless you're not selling your house, unless you're only paying property tax against it, then it's really unfortunate.
Right.
And so because we've had such increased property values, we've we've really kind of hurt people that aren't doing that. And I think that we have to look at reforms to that in order to kind of work through that. and I don't know. I've heard suggestions before, like maybe somebody after a certain point in their life, their house should never go up in value. I think there may be something to be said for that. Now, maybe there's some caveats in that. I think that I've heard before that maybe we should only reassess every 5 years. Or I think there's a lot of things like that can be done in order to kind of deal with that assessment. But this isn't the city assessor's office doing anything illegal. In fact, they're doing what they're required to do by law.
Right. And I'm not as well versed in this as I should be, so I shouldn't even mention it. But isn't there a percentage that they have to be to like the value that it actually sells for, or something like that?
So again, I don't want to give wrong. Here's one thing I will tell you that I can answer this is that if a property sells, no matter what it sells at, that automatically becomes the appraised value of that. And I can tell you that because I can think of somebody right now who would come forward to us all the time and be like, you guys are overpricing my value of my house. And I can't believe there's no way I could ever sell you for that. Well, it's currently in the process of being sold for about 40% over what we were assessing it at. Wow. So in all reality, the city was assessing that value lower, but also the city assessors can only base it on like local, other similar buildings and stuff like that. And as that continues to go up. So again, that's an area where, and we can talk a lot about housing in this community and solutions and things like that. But unfortunately that's being driven by increase in valuations. And I do believe there are things that we can do, but no matter what, like I said, we have to hold the actual value, hold the line on how much we bring in, not just in mill levy, but how much we bring in, and build our budget from there.
So we have a budget right now that for this year is close to it's 199 million and some, right?
Yep.
Is there? And I know that sounds like a huge number, or whatever. It's not the scare tactic. That's not supposed to be a scare tactic. But my question is there stuff that needs to be cut? Is there fat in that budget that needs to be cut out, or are we do you feel like we have a pretty lean budget as it is?
One of the things that I continue to say is that, I can definitely look through the budget and point out, hey, we should cut here and we should cut there.
Yeah.
But I continue to go to the city leaders and say, you guys tell me where you're going to cut it.
Right.
To sit there on a dais and micromanage, I am not an engineer. I'm not a water sewer expert to sit there and be like, we don't need that.
Right.
When I think they're better prepared to answer that. There are, of course, some things that maybe I have personal grudges against.
Yeah.
And when it comes about that process, I'll talk about that. And biggest thing that I keep saying too is that, I've definitely heard people talk about, property taxes being too high, but I've also heard people talk about the streets are in disrepair. I've also heard people talk about my water's yellow. I've heard people talk about why do these water lines keep busting out in front of my house all the time.
Right.
Those are all legitimate things. So we have to kind of find that right balance there.
Right.
And we also want to make sure we don't kick the can down to the future too far, because time and time again, I talk a lot about sustainable budgeting. That's unsustainable. Like, it is going to come back and burn us eventually, and it's going to cost us more. The best time to fix some of these problems was 5 years ago, before all the craziness happened. If we could have done then, we could have done a heck of a lot cheaper, and it would have been better. But we didn't do it then. And again, I'm not throwing any past councils under it. It's just the reality is the best time to do anything when you talk about major repairs is 5 years ago, because it was always cheaper.
Right. Exactly. And that's something that comes up on city council occasionally is the two words, deferred maintenance.
Yes.
And it's sometimes I'll say this from a consumer standpoint or a citizen standpoint. Sometimes it sounds like it's a guilt, like this is deferred maintenance. We should have taken care of this 5 years. Sometimes it feels like it's fair. We got to take care of this. Otherwise, we're going to be in the same position we were in this scenario over here. And it's all truth. Yep. Because the fact of the matter is you guys are right. And it does require, eventually we're going to have to pay for it. But obviously the best plan is one that for the most part mitigates deferred maintenance. Yeah. Do you feel like you guys have city officials, the city department leaders have done a good job over the past couple of years of trying to get that under control?
I think we're doing a better job. I think there's no further advantage or example of that than roads. Mm-hmm. If you go back to 2019 budget, we spent $1,090,000, I believe it was, on roads total, on streets and pavement. in our current budget, we're spending 8, but we're still not up to where we need to be. We
Right.
probably need to be at closer to 16 to actually be getting caught up, but we're slowly catching up from some just years. And again, I hear about that. The only thing, and I also hear, it's funny because the only thing I hear about more when people complain about them bad roads is road construction, because, and I get it. I don't like road construction. Heck,
Right now, traffic's terrible in Minot.
terrible. And I was almost late getting to the interview today because I got stuck in all of it. And I was like,
Right.
I forgot what, 5:30 traffic's like, but it is. But again, that's the process of us getting better.
Right.
That's the healing process is that. And so you can see, as you see that road construction, that's that continued and new investment in streets and roads in our community. And also the complexities of that, some of that is federal dollars, some of that is state dollars, some of that is, city dollars. There's all these different reasons. And we have a relatively short construction season in North Dakota. So luckily this year, because of our lack of snow, we've been able to get an early start on it. And many of the projects are significantly ahead of schedule, which is good. But yeah, there's a lot going on.
So that brings another interesting thing, though. We had a lot less snow this year.
Yeah.
And so obviously a budget is exactly that, an expectation of anticipated costs. But I imagine that there's probably less money that was spent on snow, and I'm sure that there was snow removal, and I'm sure that there's other things that vary, and there's probably things that were above anticipated. Do we do a good job of moving funds around so that way there's not surpluses or heavy amounts of surpluses? I'm sure it's a good thing to have a little bit of surplus at the end of the year, but not like major surpluses at the end of the year.
There is definitely a certain amount of flexibility that comes in about. And so we, and one of the things, like we just got done with the city budget tours and we could double the size of the city budget and still probably not meet all the possible needs. So we're always saying no to stuff all the time. We're
Absolutely.
Always, and so sometimes it's like, well, now we have some extra money here because this didn't happen.
Right.
Let's go ahead and fix this right now. Because for lack of a better term, I mean, that's money that's in the bank.
Yeah.
And so it's easier to pay for it now than have to pay for it 3 years from now or go back to the taxpayers and ask for it. And that being said, I have also asked the city to, kind of work on maybe some budget to maybe make better plans for some of that, like maybe we can plan for a certain amount of, say staff turnover. The reality is that the city, just like everybody else, has staff turnover issues. So maybe there's some positions that we can fund them at 50% because they may not be or maybe open for part of the year. Maybe there's some creativity funding that we can do in that in order to help bring down that budget to get us to that point that we talked about where we don't have to increase taxes. So.
Right. Yeah. Interesting stuff for sure. So a couple more things on taxes. One of them is the tax. The TIF issues that come up. All right. We've asked most candidates this. We've seen 2 examples of this recently. One was the Big M building and one was the tracks. Yeah. Okay. And obviously I believe you made votes on both of those decisions. But basically, did one deserve the TIF? Did one did not? How do you feel like that? When is a TIF? When should a TIF be used?
I don't actually believe I voted on the Big M building. I think that predated me.
Yeah.
I voted on the tracks, and that was one of the harder votes I had. And sometimes when you're listening, you're voting, it comes down to a coin flip on is this really what I wanted or what isn't it? And I go back and forth on whether or not that was the right decision. I ultimately voted for it only because I'm listening to voters. And one of the things I hear is that there's nothing to do in this town.
Right.
And especially younger people. When you look at people 30 and younger, they're looking for some form of entertainment. Now, I think there's tons of stuff to do in this town.
Right.
I think people need to look harder. I certainly have got more to do than I have time.
Right.
But that being said, I recognize the fact that, the version of that they have in West Fargo is bringing in concerts. They've got concerts there on a regular basis. That is something to do that has value. So I did ultimately vote for that TIF. Now, into a bigger question about what kind of TIFs I would support or wouldn't support. I have been from day one talking about we need to reduce the outgrowth of our city. One of the biggest reasons our city budget is growing is because the footprint of our city is growing. Because as we've got to bring fire and water and policing and sewer and streets to all of these further out communities, that's really great for the developers. It's really bad for the long-term sustainability of our budget. Yeah. And so I am not a big fan of TIFs that are going to be in the green space on the edge of town. I am a fan of TIFs when they're within that circle, when we're talking about infill and when we're talking about things like affordable housing and we're talking about things like that. I think that again, going back to one of the surveys that we recently had talking about housing and the housing crisis and how expensive housing is here in town, if we can use TIFs to create better environments for people to live, and more affordable environments, I will be for that all day long. I think that it's interesting. Minot's had 3 total TIFs. They've also had Blue on Broadway, which was a TIF which has some low to moderate income housing as part of that. Other cities have been using these for 20 years and 30 years. And I feel like by not being part of that, many of those economic factors, if you were to go to some bigger cities and they've got multi-million-dollar businesses that are properties that were given a kick in the butt with TIFs, they're now economic engines for those communities. And Minot wasn't doing that. And I think that we've got to be more, again, going back to, we have to compete on a global and regional and local marketplace for that.
Yeah. So you mentioned preferring TIFs in the infill or in town. How do you balance that as development does hit the edges of town? Obviously, North Hill wasn't always North Hill, but obviously, using obviously a lot here, you do need to make sure that your core is strengthened before you start going and developing on your edges. How do you balance that? Trinity, this is a massive project that they're doing on the edge of town. That's probably going to move the cityscape in the next 20 years to really include that. I mean, a hospital isn't intended to be on the edge of town. It's intended to be towards the center of town. So just as you make decisions and stuff like that, does that play into your decision making too much?
Yes. I mean, and here's the deal. I recognize the fact, you look at the size of the footprint that Trinity is, there's not a whole lot of infill opportunities for something that big.
Right.
And if it was, it would probably mean destroying some neighborhood or something like that. And I'm certainly not for that.
Right.
But Trinity, I think, has to be, and it's a $500 million exception, but it is an exception.
Right.
But even you mentioned North Hill. A good example of that is that as Minot grew, for a while there, construction sort of stopped. And so if you look up around the new Ramstead area, if you look behind Minot North,
it is a good example.
There was infrastructure there, but there wasn't building going. And one of the things that we did was we reintroduced a 1 year for the developer and 2 years for the property owner tax abatements if people develop housing up there. And we saw a significant increase in housing since we've done that. And that's something that can just help lower that cost, because unfortunately, building houses is expensive. It's expensive everywhere, but it's super expensive here. So if that's something the city can do to kind of get that going, because the city is going to make a lot more on that with a house sitting there than it's going to make as an empty field. Yeah. And that is within that infill area. It's actually called arrested developments, which I got a kick out of because of a TV show. But getting those arrested developments where there's already infrastructure there, getting that incentivized within that green space. And I think we have a lot more opportunity for that.
It definitely is an interesting balance, because right now you don't necessarily lose revenue when a TIF is given. In certain cases, maybe you do, but you just don't get the immediate gain to the development that's coming. And I want to talk about growth in 1 minute. First, I want to ask one last question on property taxes, and that has to do with the Renaissance Zone program, which is not a TIF program, but it's similar. It has similar attributes to it, where people or businesses are able to get tax abatements on their tax bill as they go and make some developments to their project. There was recently some changes or updates that were made to the program where it becomes extended out and stuff like that. Is this a program that you feel has seen good success in Minot?
Going back to, let me answer the changes first, because going back to what I hear from people, and I live on North Side, and the number of times that I hear people talk about, we've got to do something about the hotels on North Side of Minot. And the problems there now. Now there's a long answer to that that's an entirely different show, because essentially what they're doing right now is meeting a housing need for people that can't find housing elsewhere. Right. But all that being said, I hear all the time, can the city do anything about that? And the answer is there's not a whole lot we can probably do. But one of the things we can do is if a developer wants to come in and use that as a Renaissance zone, and they want to invest in those and get those cleaned up and make them better, and they want to invest a significant amount of money in doing that, we can do that tax abatement. So that's something the city can do now. If that happens, if all three of the kind of questionable properties that were just part of that became part of that tomorrow, we're going to have a massive homeless problem in Fargo, or in Minot. Well, Fargo. Yeah. Right. But in Minot. But we'll deal with that. I don't think that's going to happen that fast. Right. So that's the thing. Now, as far as a benefit for it, I talked about this before too. Obviously most of the the Renaissance Zone has been downtown.
Yes.
And look at how much downtown has changed in the last 5-6 years. You go downtown on a Tuesday night now, just a random Tuesday night, and it's hard to find a place to park.
Right.
It wasn't that long ago, the streets were dead. And businesses that are now employing dozens of people and, millions of dollars of economic activity used to be empty warehouses or secondhand stores that weren't really selling a whole lot. There's so much good stuff happening down there right now. And I think we're getting that back. I talked about how there's one business that's been off of the tax abatement for several years now, that prior to that, it was worth $179,000 and it's worth like $1.6 million now.
Wow.
And before it was a warehouse, now it is a, business and with housing there and creating jobs and everything else. So, and again, we're not adding new fire. We're not adding new streets. We're not adding new infrastructure because that stuff is already there. And so I think that there's been unquestionably, benefits to this community by doing that.
Right. So we'll move to economic growth. And one of the questions that comes up with the tax abatements or tax incentive programs is, why isn't Minot just so grand by itself that a developer would just see the value in Minot as is and would be willing to come and spend that money? Do you see that as a problem in conversations that maybe you've had with key players, that developers don't see that value in Minot?
So the issue is that if somebody is going to develop, they're going to make a decision to either choose Minot or to choose another community. And if those other communities are already doing that, they're going to go to those communities. Yeah. And this is what I talked about when I said we've fallen behind other communities in economic development, and because other communities have already been doing that, and they've been doing it for years. There's nothing stopping them from investing here now, except for they weren't. Like, why was it that downtown basically went from whenever malls opened up, the early 70s or something like that, and all the business sort of sucked out of downtown?
Yeah.
For the next 40 years, there wasn't a whole lot happening. Well, any time during that, somebody could have stepped up. But who I listen to is actually the people who have invested.
Yeah.
And they tell me that the incentives that we did helped kind of make it possible. And it told us that the city is willing to invest in itself so that they would invest here. Because those folks could have invested out on the green spaces on the edge of town. They could have invested in Bismarck or in Fargo or in Arizona or whatever, but they chose to come here. And because of that, look at all the good stuff that's happening. And the one thing we agree on is that property values are going through the roof, and that has been, and including commercial property is continuing to go up. It's working. like we can say, well, people will just kind of do it no matter what. But they can get those incentives elsewhere, or they can build where it's cheaper.
Right. Yeah. Do you think, and I think it was interesting, recent news is the Amazon warehouse or fulfillment center, or whatever it is, that is being built in Minot. And some are saying that part of the reason why it's a great spot for them is because it's close to the border. I don't know if that's true or not. I haven't researched that, but it's still an interesting thing. We are one of the last big cities to Canada in the central region of North Dakota. Is that something that is used as a selling point in some of those conversations with developers?
Absolutely. We are a regional hub. And I want people to shop locally because, local pays off, but I also am a realist to realize that I see all the Amazon boxes in front of my neighbor's yards and everything else. So, and I, please don't hate me, local businesses, but I may have ordered a thing or two on Amazon myself.
Right. Yeah. They did too.
Yes. But the reality is that being able to get that regional center here. And the other thing to keep in mind too is that we also have, rail through here. And right now, Amazon does a lot of things by truck, but boy, I'd sure like to see them take advantage of the railway. We have, the port up there that's right now sending products from North Dakota over to the Pacific Ocean and off to other countries. Well, wouldn't it be great if they were coming back with loads full of stuff for our Amazon center or any other center that's out there? I think that is the untapped potential for that region, is to be able to do that. So, and you're right, we are a regional hub here. And you know what, why are we shipping that stuff further onto Fargo or anywhere else? Like, we can get that done right here. And if, rail tends to be less expensive than trucks. So let's get it here. So
very good. All right, let me preface this question because it might sound unfair. In 2016, we were 47,000 some people. In 2024, we're we got that 50,000, but I think our official population is right around that 47,000.
Mm-hmm.
Does Minot need to worry about growth in population?
Yeah, and I think it comes down to housing costs. I really do. I think that you're seeing more growth in some of the smaller communities around us because it's maybe a little bit less expensive.
Yeah.
We can make the argument that property tax is part of it, and I'm not going to totally disagree with that. But also, when you look at the number of apartments and how many people in Minot are living what's considered housing poor, so spending more than 30% of their income on housing is ridiculous.
Hard.
And the number of people spending more than 50 is really scary.
Right.
So the lack of housing in this community is very uninviting. And
Right.
so if we can work on incentivizing and increased growth of housing, because we need it, because we'll do it. There's also like national trends with like less people living per square foot in your house and family size shrinking and things like that. But we're gonna be able to refill it. If we can bring our housing costs a little bit more under control, I think we'll start to see those populations rebound again. And again, because there's jobs here. So if we can get place people to live and it can be somewhat affordable, and we have jobs that are paying okay, we're gonna have people come to this community. And then we need them to stay within the city of Minot too.
Yeah. Right. Don't forget about that requirement.
Right.
So it seems like a really common thing to hear, at least on the podcast episodes that I've done, is that somebody grew up in Minot, they maybe went to Minot State or they moved away for college, and then when they were ready to start a family, they came back. Essentially, maybe that storyline isn't exactly right, but essentially like that. They move away in their early 20s, they come back probably in their late 20s or early 30s. Is there something that Minot needs to do in order to? We're probably not going to keep them in that age. They probably are going to move away, but to instill that factor of, hey, you got to come back.
First off, one of the things I'm fond of saying is we've got to stop defining ourselves by the 10 worst days of the year. Yeah. Like, yes, it is cold here. Yes, we have snow, but we have beautiful days like today too. And people don't talk about that enough. And far too often, people that live here, perhaps are missing out a little bit of the magic of this community. Yeah. It's not just a place you live until you go to winter in Arizona. Right. This is actually a really great community with so many things going on. Continuing to talk about that and promote that. I had an opportunity a while back to speak to some students up at Minot State, and I remember one in the room who was just, you could tell, that wanted nothing to do with this conversation. Okay. But I had 3 or 4 others in there who were like, what, he's making a good point. There is a lot to do here. Yeah. There is some good stuff going on. I happen to work in an office where a majority of my staff are Minot transplants. Wow. I don't really know why, but that's how it's turned out. And each of those people have chosen this community. And I have a young 24-year-old who came here from Minot State. She ran long distance at the school, left as soon as she graduated and moved back home, and then quickly missed it. And she's moved back now. And when I asked her why she moved back, she said, because there's so much going on in this town. Wow. There's so much to do. And so we need to tell that story a little bit more to attract people. And I know it's hard. There is, as you said, there's something about that kind of wild young spirit of when you're 18 years old and you have all the answers in the world that you're going to go out and explore. But a lot of it's going to come back. And here's the other thing, too. I'm a Gen Xer who grew up believing and hearing about how North Dakota was going to become this bad land of, nothing, and nobody's going to live here and all the best and brightest leave. Well, that's not true anymore. In fact, there's so much good going here that a majority of people are staying. So
that's fantastic. Yeah, I mean, there's a ton of opportunity. You even just look at what we're doing right now. You go and you move to a large, Chicago, and that opportunity is going to present itself a lot different way because there's so much. It's such an easy community to get involved in.
Yeah, I have a friend of mine who lives in Orange County, California. She does the same job as I do. And I'm talking about, even before I was elected, like I'm meeting with the mayor or I'm meeting with county commissioners, and there's no way she could do any of that stuff.
Right.
But we're approachable here. You can come and talk to us. And, there's nothing I love more than having a cup of coffee with somebody and talking about what's going on. And I think she thinks that's all I do all day is just have coffee and conversations with people. But I just think that's something that's easy to do here. And most people are, people that are involved are looking for a little help, and there's so many opportunities. It's a matter of how do you want your life to be in this community.
So you were on the Human Relations Committee, and we talked about that. So we don't have to talk about that today. But something that I brought up on these interviews is that, and even the flag issue that predates you, that came up with City Council and with the city itself. But the question is this. Those things as the basis, what role does the city play in regulating or monitoring social issues that may continue to come up over time?
So I've always said that one of the things that I think city council can be is just a sounding board. Like people can come and tell their stories and you know, it doesn't mean we can always do something, but sometimes there's just value in that space to like come in and tell a story. So if somebody is struggling with whatever, sometimes we can do something.
Right.
Other times we can just listen. And contrary to maybe some of the political shots that are being fired right now, we do listen and we do hear. And it doesn't mean that we can always do something, but we do hear. Yeah. And I think that that's something that the city council can do. Again, I want Minot to be promoted as such. I just talked, I give you an example. I just talked to somebody this weekend and she said, I can't wait to vote for you when I move here. And then I was like doing the math in my head and being like, well, you're not going to make it because she thought the election was in November.
Right.
But she is a person who identifies as queer. She is a person who lives in another state right now that she doesn't like a lot about it. And she wants to move here because there's so much cool stuff going on in this community.
That's incredible.
Yeah. And I'm like, you know what? I happen to know what her career path is. There's a shortage of them. I was like, here, I got some names I can hook you up with. You're like, let's get you here. Like, let's be ambassadors because we need folks that live or that want to move here and that can feel safe. And she was talking to other members of the community that also said that. And I think that's great. That's the kind of stuff that I think council can do is just be a sounding board and listen. And then from time to time, maybe we can set in and apply a little pressure here or there or provide some proper information because believe it or not, the information you receive like on social media might not always be accurate.
Whoa.
I know.
But Abraham Lincoln said everything on the internet was true.
That's right.
Yeah. So, but it's interesting because do you feel like Minot is a welcoming community to every social, for all social aspects?
I don't know that there's ever a place that's perfect.
Yeah.
And I've definitely heard from people and heard their stories about how at times it isn't, but I've also heard from people who have said, yes, it is.
Right.
And all I can do is believe each of those for who they are and for where they came from. I think that at times, it's funny, I recently was at a comedy roast of Mayor Tom Ross, and one of the jokes was that how much Tom says born and raised in Minot, because he does. And the reality is that's great. I'm glad that he was born and raised here, but not everybody was born and raised here. Yeah. And I think that those of us who are now from this community can maybe just spend a little bit more time welcoming people when they come in and realizing that, I moved here in the middle of the oil boom. I didn't come here for oil. Right. Would have been more money in that, but I didn't. But at the same time, like maybe at the early days I was, maybe didn't feel super welcomed. And I heard a little bit of that. This town is ruined. It's not what it used to be. And I'm like, of course it's not, but no place is where it used to be. What can it be going forward? How can we make this town stronger moving forward and take advantage of all the opportunity that exists here? So
is there like a YouTube video of this comedy roast?
I don't think there is, unfortunately. Oh, man. Yeah. That's probably some lost opportunity for revenue there.
Yeah, because that sounds pretty interesting right there. We're going to close in a minute, and at that point I have some very specific questions for you. But before we get there, I want to talk on the city satisfaction survey. Mm-hmm. And there's 3 points that we've gone over. One of them is that there was a general consensus that is around town that Minot is a safe community. I think generally people would feel that way. But on the satisfaction survey, 44% felt Minot is becoming less safe. That's almost 50% of Minot felt like we're in a direction that's becoming less safe. This is obviously a concern for some Minot citizens, but how do you think it could be addressed? Or it is being addressed, perhaps? Yeah,
I think that... So first off, again, one of the changes that used to be that you'd hear, when you watch the KX News at night, you'd find out what the story was, or KMOT News at night you'd hear, or maybe you'd get the newspaper in the morning. Well, nowadays you're finding out this stuff in real time. Right. The police department and T at the police department does a good job of getting press releases out when it's appropriate, and then everybody has a chance to come on and comment. Right. And it can be scary. I mean, my wife and I happened to drive by incident this weekend where the police had their guns drawn. Yeah. Believe me, we were scared. I'm definitely not a person to sit here and say that was, a great safe moment for the city of Minot. Luckily, our PD and the professionals they are were able to de-escalate that situation without any harm being caused, which goes to the professionalism that they have. But that being said, I think that the reality is I can still walk down the street at any time here in town and be safe.
Right.
I can still, I don't want to advertise this too much, but I've forgotten to lock my car doors from time to time. And luckily nothing.
What's your license plate number?
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't mean that we don't need to be safety. But again, going back to when I talk to people from other communities, one of the reasons that people come here is that they feel safe. That being said, we can still do things to improve it and continuing to fund our law enforcement, continuing to have, I think that when money presents itself, having more of a public safety officer that really works on connecting with members of the public about how to be safe, I think is in the future. I think our crime prevention work that the police department does is extraordinarily important. I'm really glad of the relationship I have with members of our police department and how much work they've done in my day job in working to deal with addiction crisis and mental health crises here in town, which is part of this answer for how do we make our community safer. Right. There's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah. And I mean, that's city police department that's been working understaffed for like ever.
Right.
They do a good job. Another point that came out on the city satisfaction survey, there seems to be some concern about the involvement of the public in decision making. And this has been addressed a few times, and now we can talk about it in full bore. Only 18% feel that they are satisfied with this. Is there change that needs to happen in the involvement of people's voices of the city?
Jonathan, this is one of those things where I haven't been on council a whole lot, and there is a certain, I've been on a year and a half, and I've definitely learned a whole bunch. And they say when you join, you're like drinking from a fire hose. Yeah. And so there's so much information. But if there is one thing that I do want to see changed, I love the ideals of having consistent public forums. Let's bring people in. Let's go to, an area and let's sit down and have conversations with folks. Yeah. I am a person that, as I said earlier, I stay pretty active in this community. I'm out and about and talking to people quite a bit and trying to talk to different people that aren't just exactly like me. But I also like the idea of having some formal discussions around that and being able to listen. And I hope that people, I feel like we've gotten away from that as a society to some degree. Like, let's sit down and have a civil conversation, and that even if you disagree with me on something, I'm not your enemy. And if you are different than me, you're not my enemy. Like, we're still all brothers and sisters in this community. And let's get back to that a little bit. And I do think that there's something being said for that.
I've had the pleasure or difficulty or whatever it is of interviewing candidates all across the state for this election cycle that we're in. And it is that way where it just feels like if you don't agree with that person's beliefs, and it can be inter-party, it can be across party, it doesn't matter. There's such tension right now. And whatever we can do to resolve that is and
that's helpful. One of the things, I'm pretty, again, non-political. It's not that I'm not aware of politics, but I tend not to get, again, it's not my life. Right. And part of the reason for that is that I believe that I've never met a Republican or a Democrat pothole. I believe we need to fix problems. Right. And we need to solve problems. And we need to all come together to make the best solutions. And I just think that, part of that is maybe toning down the rhetoric a little bit. Yep. And being able to get together. And I'm a big fan of volunteer in your community. Like, before you decide you're going to run for office, get out and volunteer. Go show up at one of the food shelves in town and help out, or show up at, volunteer as a mentor or something like that. Like, there's so much you can do that people don't really care about what your politics are. Right. And that's what we need to get back to. Yeah.
It's a good point. We asked the question, and this isn't part of the survey, but we asked the question from the survey. 18% feel like they're not satisfied with that or are whatever. I want to ask you this, though, because we asked it in the what do we need to change? Mm-hmm. You've been on the city council for a year and a half. What are you guys doing to listen to the people of Minot?
First off, we definitely do. I mean, we get emails.
Right.
I'm not going to, as I've said it somewhere else, I'm not going to tell you I've responded to every single email.
Yeah.
Because for some facts we get a lot, and also some people just email everybody, and unless it's personal, I might not respond, but it doesn't mean I don't read it.
Right.
I have responded to a lot. I responded to a lot of phone calls. I've responded to I've had a lot of, again, like I said earlier, cups of coffee or just conversations with people. I've been out and about in our community, listening to folks as much as I can.
Yeah.
I think that, the mayor, when Tom Ross was elected, he made a few changes where he wanted to make it a little easier for people to communicate. I've heard during this election, maybe we aren't doing enough of that, I can definitely respect Tom's role as the mayor, but I think maybe we can engage a little bit more within the confines of a meeting to be like, let's have conversations around this stuff. And years ago, it used to be that, the public comment section was at the beginning. So no matter what you wanted to have comments on that night, you could stand up and do it. And at some point that was changed to be towards the end. Well, maybe that's something we need to talk about changing again to, if there's something on consent agenda that you want to talk about, if there's something on before we get to public comments that you want to give comments on, maybe that's something we can do. And, but that's ultimately the mayor's, responsibility.
Right. And I asked that question, not as one to be like, are you guys actually listening? I ask it because I think it's overlooked what is going on too.
And what are the things that kind of respond a little bit to the whole, you don't listen. We hear from lots of people. Right. And just because we have a couple of angry people show up at city council doesn't mean they're necessarily representative of everybody we hear from. Right. And I would ask that of any of the candidates, if say they are anti-property taxes, and if I got 10 angry people to show up and say they wanted to increase property taxes, would they? Well, no, because they're talking to enough people to have a good enough sample to say our property taxes are too high and we need to lower them. And because we had, we have to listen to everybody. Right. And that's important to remember too. So
we mentioned it on a different interview, but like sometimes there probably comes a moment where you have to make a vote. And I believe you've done this, that you're not necessarily a fan of the vote that you're making, but it's based off the response that you've gotten back from the citizens. Like, all right, if this is what you guys want, this is what we're going to do. Yes. Obviously, I think there's certain areas where you can't cross that line.
And I've talked about this before. Like, there is probably 2 votes a year that are just absolute moral issues. Yeah. This is it. This is how I feel. I don't care if there's 1,000 people rising up against me as an elected official. I'm willing to risk it all for this vote. But those votes are really few and far between. Yeah. Next, I'm going to listen. And I'm going to listen to maybe to the staff. You hear me do that a lot. I mean, I ask, Alderman Potagula asks more questions than I do, but I tend to ask a lot of questions too to get clarifying. And I'll send emails in advance and get the data down. I'll sit down with the city manager or city staff to kind of research and understand issues when it's important to do so. So I'm going to listen and then make my decision from that. I'm going to listen to the voters. I'm going to listen to what they say. And you're right. There have been one or two incidences where maybe I wasn't my favorite vote in the world, but I've listened and listened to what people say. And on the bottom of that list for me is what any political party says. Don't care about that. I'm not here to impress people in Washington, D.C. Yeah. I'm not here to impress people that do that. That's not my world.
Yeah, absolutely. The last point from the city satisfaction survey was respondents indicated the biggest issues facing Minot within the next 5 years include high taxes, property taxes, finances. That was one item. That was 80%. Housing affordability was 61%, and crime 51%. These are what the citizens of Minot are saying are the issues within the next 5 years. What issues do you see in the next maybe term or 5 years for Minot, and how closely do they align with those?
Look, again, I've talked about this a lot. I do believe property taxes is a problem, and we have to stop the growth of property taxes, and we have to eventually wean our way off of that. Yeah. And part of that is, and that we haven't talked about this enough, but is figuring out how to pay for stuff in other ways. And part of that is growing the size of our economic pie, that as we bring in more, we also just had our all-time highest month in sales tax in the history of the city. All right. So there, again, good things happening. Well, that's going to help reduce our dependence on property taxes as an economic tool to pay for the needs of this community. And so I think that property taxes is definitely part of it. I'm going to go go and talk a little bit about crime, because I think we do have to talk about, we have an addiction crisis and we have a mental health crisis in this town. Now I'm glad that I worked with North Central Human Service Center. The city was able to come in and endorse the community mental health clinic, which will be the first in the state. We're one of only 3 states that don't have them. And the first one that will be in North Dakota will be at North Central Human Service Center, which will allow for us to be much more aggressive with mental health and be able to deal with it before it hits that crisis stand. And before somebody is homeless and potentially committing crime as a result of that. There's so much growth that's happening right now in our community as far as opening the door up for sober living homes, opening up the door for rehab facilities. Don't get me wrong, there's a huge amount more to work to be done, but when you look at where we were 5 years ago versus where we are now, we have made strides, and we've got a lot more work to do. I think that that's also part of that. I think that and I think that once you get the mental health, and I say this from multiple conversations with our police department, with officers,
right?
If we can get the mental health and the addiction crisis under control, we're going to see less crime,
right?
And
makes sense.
And so it's, again, I could sit here and tell you that we need to lock everybody up, but that just ultimately leads to higher bills and doesn't really solve the problem,
right?
And then I do agree that the housing crisis is the next biggest issue. We have to build more affordable housing. We have to build more moderate income housing. We have to probably build more upper income housing. We just need more housing. Yeah. We need places for people to live where they can live on the incomes that they earn locally.
Absolutely. Yeah. The stuff that you mentioned on the addiction and all that and mental health issues is really interesting. And even the homelessness is something that we should legit, to use the modern term, do a podcast on sometime, because I think that's something that the people of Minot would be interested in learning more about. We're coming to a close, but I have a couple final questions for you. What are a couple of highlights that you have from this term, this last year and a half?
Wow. You shouldn't think I'm a very positive person. The fact that I didn't have something come right to my mind is perhaps a little bit odd. I love serving the people of Minot. Right. I love being able to listen. I mean, I can talk about things like, moving into the new city hall and kind of being able to be part of that. I can talk about the fact that we're in the process right now of building a new public transportation hub next to city hall in the parking garage downtown. How cool that's going to be for people to take advantage of that. I think that the mental health clinic that I talked about is definitely a highlight. I think that, I was able to be on council when Trinity opened up. I didn't do anything, but I'm not at all taking credit for that, but I was able to be there and be part of that. Right. I think those are kind of a few of the things. I think we've done some cool stuff that are really behind the scenes that are going to make a big impact moving forward too.
And I think that you are the youngest person on council, not an actual age, but as in terms years served. Yep. So you're most closest from being a citizen, just a normal citizen, to being a politician, as we joked about earlier. What is the role that you see that city council, we talked about the role of government and city, but the role that city council should play?
So first off, I think that the best government is the one closest to the people, and there's nothing closer to the people than city council. We live in this community. We work in this community. We pay high property taxes. We pay, we struggle with snow removal. We struggle with all the same things that everybody else does. Right. And so I really think that, that makes it perhaps the best form of government, is that we should be the most receptive to people. Yeah. As I said, joke I talk about when we, the national political candidates couldn't point Minot out on a map, and if they did, they probably pronounce it Minot. Yeah, you're right. And so we can make the decisions that matter so much in people's lives, and I think that can be the role, is to really be the citizens' form of government, the government closest to the people. Absolutely, big day coming up for you on June 11th, and we're going to point this out as much as we can over the next month, but this is not just primary day where you're voting for your candidate to be on the ballot come November. You're voting for people to actually get in office on June 11th. You're voting for city council to get in office, Minot Park Board, school board. There's a lot of elections that matter a lot more than just, and the primary is important. I'm not trying to diminish that, but these are actual elections that are going on. Why should someone vote for you come June 11th? You know what? I'm always about service first. I love this community. I want to make it better. I want to be part of the shared prosperity of this community. And that I believe that, because of the service, the life of service that I've had already, that I am well positioned to help make Minot a stronger community.
Very good. And if someone wants to support you or learn more about you, what would be the best step for them to take?
Hey, I don't have a lot of money, so I have a Facebook page, facebook.com. I think it's Burlingame for Minot, something like that. Hashtag remember the name Burlingame will always get you to my stuff. So
there you go. Very good. Awesome. Well, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Jonathan, for this opportunity.
Absolutely. This has been another edition of the Minot Matters podcast here at the Dakota, brought to you by Shock, Save, and Lock. I'm Jonathan Starr. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, like and subscribe on YouTube, and be on the lookout. Every Tuesday at 2 o'clock, we're going to be going live talking about Minot Talk, whatever it might be that week. We'll be talking about City Council, some of the latest headlines. We'll be interviewing some key players live in the city of Minot to talk about those issues as well. It's going to be a great time, so make sure you stop by our stuff every Tuesday at 2 p.m. Thank you for watching this video. Have a great